Hey everybody, welcome to today's live stream. Sorry the topic didn't update properly. So today's topic is actually about game design, and we're going to be talking about indie games today. And we're going to kind of mix it up a little bit today. We're going to talk about kind of the design and production and the various ins and outs of being an indie game developer versus kind of a AAA game developer. And then we're also going to play some stuff today. Thought I'd mix it up with a little bit of gameplay this week and do some game deconstruction. If you guys don't know what that is, that's basically playing a video game, and we're going to kind of see what I like and don't like. And so I randomly chose a bunch of games today on my Xbox Game Pass, and I'm going to be playing it on my Xbox One here for you to see. And these are all, I chose these all really randomly. They're all stuff that I would assume is kind of an indie game or slightly indie type games. And I think as a game designer and somebody who makes video games, it's really important that you look at stuff that's both big AAA, the high profile, big titles, but you also have to understand what indie games are and how those differ as well. And so, let's dive in. I'm going to play one game to start with just to get us all warmed up today and have a little bit of fun. And then from there, we'll kind of stop that game. We'll come back in and we'll talk about indie games a little bit. But this will give everybody who's running late today a few minutes to jump into the game, into the stream and check it out. So let's start with this game called Rise and Shine. Again, this is on the Xbox Game Pass. I have honestly no idea what this game is. This will be my first time seeing the game. I have not heard about the game. So I just kind of chose some stuff randomly just to kind of see, what was out there. So let's give it a try. So art style, is so far, is really good. I like the highly stylized look of this, this interface front end. It's pretty simple, but still effective. It has a lot of motion and graphics to it. It's animated and kind of feels alive. And I believe this is a Cartoon Network game. So this one is, I believe, a licensed title, but I think it's still something that's a little bit more indie, or, meaning not as high a budget. So let's jump into tutorials and check those out. So, if you don't know, game design, one of the biggest, most important things to really get right is your tutorials. And one of the problems in a lot of indie games is that you quite often, with your lower budget and your smaller times and your smaller teams, don't have the time to do things right. You're often cutting corners and you're doing things, on cheaper budgets and stuff like that. And so quite often, a lot of indie games will kind of not get the tutorials right. And so this is a good test to kind of see how the tutorials are going to work for this particular game. So pretty straightforward. I really like in the top left corner how it has the picture of the controller, and it's showing the button, it's flashing the button with an arrow there. It's really, really clear what you got to do and what you got to press. And I think that's a healthier, better solution, especially if this is targeted at kids or new players, that really makes what you need to do. Oh, got a double jump there. So, pull this out and shoot. Good effects, good. Now, here's something I'm noticing right now. Now this is probably one of my biggest gripes against a lot of indie games, and this is what's really hard, is that the controls and the interface when you're designing a game are kind of everything. And a lot of indie games just kind of take like either basic default controllers that they might find in Unity or they might find in Unreal, and they just kind of use those. Like they might have a basic FPS kit or a basic third-person controller kit, something like that gives them those basic abilities, and they feel like, this thing's in here, it works, it's good enough. But the reality is that getting controls right really does make or break your game. And one of the problems with indie developers is you just don't have the time, resources, and sometimes even the skills or knowledge to get it right. And so right now, I am trying to aim or perceived aim at this target, but you can see how I'm barely touching my right analog stick here, and like he goes from way up almost 90 degrees above me to almost 45 degrees below me, and like I'm trying really hard to get at what I perceive it pointing at that target, but it is so sensitive, you know, if I'm pressing just straight up and down. Now, it looks like if I press and hold to the right, and I'm holding now the button all the way to the right, instead of just going up and down, I'm holding it to the right and then rotating it that way. So that is a little smoother. So that's a little bit better. But still without an aim assist. So this is something else depending on the level of complexity that you're trying to make in your game. So right now, even with this pretty big target, you saw I missed. So the aim assist here of having and sort of knowing at a long range where I'm shooting at can be really important. So depending on how big of a target you're trying to hit, you know, it can be a little tricky there to know exactly where you're going. Now, that can be okay. That can be part of your game, right? That can be something that you're you know expecting there. So we've got a nice little dash feature there. Okay, so it's got a basic cover system. So you know, for a 2D side-scrolling shooter, it's got a fair amount of well, so I took some damage here. But see, aiming is tricky there. Especially when you're trying to do it under pressure. Nope, I was able to shoot that bullet out of the air, which is nice. So there we go. So a little bit tricky there, not too bad. We'll see how it progresses in the difficulty of it. It's not a bad little cover system there, but again, the aiming and the controls were a little bit tough. So again, depending on the complexity of the game that you're trying to build, you know, that can be a little hard. So we'll jump in real quick. we're just gonna play this for like 5 minutes just to get a sense of it. And part of what I'm trying to do in this game deconstruction is to get you, you know, whether you're one of my students in the game design course, whether you're thinking about becoming a student, or whether you're interested in game design, is that I do a lot of what's called shotgun playing. And so what I'll do is go into a lot of these types of games and play them for anywhere from 30 minutes to 1 or 2 hours, typically an average about an hour. And in most games, you know, unless it's like an MMO or has some longer term stuff, some mobile games, things like that, within an hour you can generally pick up a vast majority of the mechanics. And so quite often I will just play every single game I can get my hands on, and I'll play for 1 to 2 hours. And I'll do that instead of playing, say, one game for 30 hours. I'll play, you know, 15 or 20 games in that same time period, just to get my head wrapped around all these different games, their different mechanics, and how they're playing. And so so this methodology of what we're doing, of kind of understanding the market, understanding and doing this research, is a really important part of being a game developer. So they've got a decent little conversation system here. Now some of the graphics are a little bit, this green dude here who's very highly pixelated. Now maybe there's going to be a reason for why he's so pixelated. But that was kind of an interesting thing in that he was very out of place. Like everything else has very smooth edges, and you know everything else feels very, you know, kind of you know, consistent. That guy that was the green pixelated guy felt very, very out of place. Same thing actually with that flag in that tutorial I was going to mention. That flag that you had to move to also was very pixelated. So consistency in your art and consistency in your design is really critical when you're making games. And so especially games that take a long time to make, sometimes you go through several art styles or you get in a hurry or whatever, and you really want to make sure that you're consistent across the games that you're making in your styles and stuff, or that things are purposeful. And so be aware of that, be careful of that. But again, this is one of those things where, you know, indie games can really suffer in that, you know, when you're time crunched and you have low resources and stuff like that. Okay, not quite sure what I'm supposed to be doing here. Okay, so well, that was fun. Yeah, so that was confusing. Like, I didn't know what I was supposed to do there. Wasn't clear that I had to run up and you know, and take cover there. Is that a cutscene, I guess? So that was a little strange because, again, I didn't do anything. Like, I didn't have a player action there. I didn't know, like, it just sort of happened. This guy died, but I'm still not sure exactly who killed him or what. There's also some inconsistency. This little piece of art here is pixelated, whereas everything else is kind of smooth. You know, so again, just some slight rough edges, not bad. But so I'm kind of just going through the story quickly here. Yeah, but see, again, like, I'm not sure. Like, I'm lost and confused right now. You know, I can only go left to right, or up. So again, just, you know, this is another problem with, again, like a lot of indie games, is that they don't always have the time to get things figured out, to get the polish, you know, in there, to really make sure that these things are consistent, that, you know, players really know, like, what to do, where to go, you know, what their quests are or their objectives, you know, that whole thing. So, like, so I'm still confused here on. So I come up to this, I can't go anywhere. Okay, so they wanted me to shoot that open. So maybe I missed it in the cutscene dialogue, but again, that was not obvious. That was just kind of like me randomly, I'm stuck, I'm going to try to do something, right? So again, the tutorial wise, you need to make sure that players don't get stuck and don't get frustrated there. Okay, so little things I got to jump over. Oof. All right, that wasn't fun. Ah, okay. So this is what I was talking about earlier wanting is something that was going to be, a bit more of a, a little bit more accurate in its shooting. Now, that being said, it doesn't go very far. So it helps when it's up close. It does help with the aiming. But the hard part is targeting stuff that's far away. Can definitely be. Yeah, it's hard to. And then, yeah, that was tough. The destructible cover as well, it's tricky. You can only stay hidden for so long. So that definitely made it challenging there. All right, so that's Rise and Shine. Gave me a basic idea, and the gameplay again. If we were to play it for an hour, we probably would have gotten a little bit more out of it. And so we will try out Ori here in a few minutes. But so indie games, indie game development, indie game design. Things with indie games that's really challenging is that you have a low budget, and there's not. So let me first start off with it. It's really hard to define exactly what an indie game is, right? So we often like to use this terminology, meaning it's not from a big studio, right? And so our industry has kind of this lingo, terminology, when you want to say it. We might say something is an indie game and something's AAA. And then occasionally we'll have something that we'll say that's A or AA. And what we're kind of referring to is the budget for that stuff. But there's not an industry standard that says like, okay, AAA is $20 million and above, and AA is $10 million and above, and single A is $5 million and above. Indie is, under $1 million. Like, there's nothing there that signifies exactly what makes something categorized as an indie game. It usually just is a generalization of that it was done with a low to no budget, and that could be, depending on the kind of game, could be something that's done for a few $100,000, to something that was done nights and weekends by one guy in the garage, and there's nothing that really says, or dictates exactly what an indie game truly is, right? Now, there's a lot of developers that might be and fall into that category between kind of indie to what we might consider an A or B level developer, meaning, like a $500,000 to $1 million budget with a mid-sized team. So in today's discussion, we're just going to be talking about kind of like this concept of indie games, this concept of doing low budget games. But I'm not trying to define that it's under $1 million or it's that. It's just, it's in comparison to the rest of what's out there. If you were to go to an EA or a Microsoft or a big studio and you look at their Call of Duty or their games that way, these indie games are being done for, a lot cheaper. They're being done typically, like I said, either with people that are either put in free labor or very cheap labor. They're often being done by, studios that are, out of the country in some cheap place, because they can be done, cheaper there. They're often done by a much smaller team. And then time doesn't really have a factor. Like some indie games are done over 5 years. A lot of them are done over a longer period of time because they have less resources. And especially if they're kind of doing nights and weekends, they'll often do it, in a longer period of time. But I also know a lot of especially mobile game indie developers who are one person, companies that basically will spend 4 to 6 months kind of on the side a little bit or whatever, and they'll purposely design very small games. A lot of those are hyper casual or stuff that's very, very, very simple, and they'll just crank something out really fast and get it out there. And so again, it doesn't have to be a long development cycle. It can be a short development cycle. But the point is that you're doing it with limited resources and limited budgets, which in the end, it all comes down to budget, right? Everything in indie game development is really about the budget and how how that budget is used. And so, even if you're a mid-tier developer, you may be facing a lot of the same problems depending on the scope and scale of the project you choose. And so this is where it gets really difficult, is a lot of people will often look at an indie game and think of it as inferior and think that, like, okay, well, if I'm playing the latest Call of Duty, and then I'm going to go off and play, an indie first-person shooter, and you compare them side by side, and obviously the indie game is not going to hold up to it. Now, an indie game can, be just as fun, and there's lots of examples of some indie games that were very cheap, well done, and were phenomenal successes. Even stuff like Flappy Birds, on mobile way back when was a little, one guy developed that in Vietnam for a very, small amount of money, and then ultimately it had massive success, and he made probably hundreds of millions of dollars off of that game, kind of by random luck a little bit. And that's a long story of where it is, but that's the problem with indie games. So the harsh reality for people, though, if you're looking to start your own indie game studio, and I get approached probably on a daily or weekly basis by people that are looking to start an indie studio, and they're trying to figure out where to get started, and it's hard. There's a lot of problems around how do you get this funded. Now, I want to talk about the funding of an indie game studio a little bit and how that's done. And this is where it's challenging, and where probably the number one biggest problem, again, is how do you get this game made in a professional kind of environment, meaning, if you really want to make it a real company. So I would say that there is kind of two tiers of indie game developers, meaning there is the indies that are going to do this nights and weekends. They got day jobs, they're making money, on the side or whatever, and then they're spending their excess time to, with some friends or with some people to try to make a game that they love, and ultimately get it out and sell it and hopefully make some extra money. And that's a perfectly acceptable choice. But the second choice is, like, how do we all quit our day jobs, right? How do we start up an actual indie developer and have an office, have employees, even if it's just 5 or 10 of us, or even if it's virtual, whatever. But the fact that we're a real company, we have, salaries and benefits and all those kinds of things, right? So how does an indie game developer do it right? Meaning, make it a real company, versus how do we make it, not doing it the nights and weekends thing. So I'm going to kind of leave the I'm an indie developer doing it nights and weekends, on the side out of this equation. And I'm going to talk about, like, how do developers really try to, make it as an indie team, when you're, struggling. So let me see here. Hi, Rushback. How's it going? Hi, Casey. Hi, Fatima. Sorry, guys, I was playing the game, didn't see your messages. Apologize for that. Yeah, I think, Fatima, well, if the target thing had been on the exit glass, yeah, it needed to have something on there that made it look, like it was damageable. So it definitely needed to have some indicator on it that maybe flashed, or an icon or something there that indicated that it was a targetable thing that, well, hi, Dennis. Yeah, sorry you can't join us for the whole thing, but remember, these are recorded. So come back to Twitch or to YouTube, and you can come watch this tomorrow. And at least you can get to, hear the whole thing. But sorry you can't be here to ask questions, but have a good night's sleep, and we'll catch you next time. And yeah, so either way, as a game designer, you want to make sure, again, things are... thanks, Dennis. I appreciate it. So either way, as a game designer, you need to make sure that things are just really clear. All right. So back to, setting up an indie game studio. It's hard. I mean, the thing that we struggle with the most is funding. And there's no easy answers here. And I get asked this a million times a week, of like, how do you get funding for a new, indie game studio? And, the harsh reality is you need funding usually to do it right. And, even if you're an on-paper company, so an on-paper company is what I call, a group of people that get together. You haven't really formed officially a company yet. You're looking for money. You're looking for a project. You're looking for a deal. You've got all your names on the resumes, so to speak. You've put together maybe an idea for a game. You've put together something basic. You may have a pitch deck, and you're out shopping for money, right? And you have to have something. So to even rewind that for a second, like to go look for money, you have to have something to show, right? So unless you can go to friends and family, so the first option for getting an initial investment is friends and family, and that could be getting $1,000 each from your mom and dad and a bunch of relatives to some people are occasionally have some friend who's willing to invest in them or willing to trust in their ideas or what they're doing. So occasionally you'll get some minor funding that's friends and family. Now, if you don't have that, and you don't have that network, and you don't have some people that can invest in you, that then you need to first of all put together your team. You need to have those 5 or 10 people that are going to be part of that core team, and you may not necessarily have to have the whole thing worked out, but you do need to know kind of who the core team is going to be. And even if you're ultimately going to have 20 people on your team, you need to kind of figure out what's the scope and scale of your planned team, and at least at a minimum 2 to 4 people that are kind of your key leads, like who's going to be your CEO, who's going to be like the head of design, the head of art, the head of programming, like who are those key people that are really going to run the project and run the company, right? And so with that, those people usually need to have some experience. And if you don't have any experience, if you're a bunch of students or people, if you're fresh out of college, whatever that is, if you've never shipped games together, either alone or together, it makes it a lot harder. And so I even in the past, I put together a team some years ago. We were working on what was going to be an Xbox One launch title. And we were kind of one of the first titles to kind of start working on next-gen technology after the Xbox 360. And we put together one of the best dream teams I've ever had. And granted, we were going AAA, not indie, but still, like our probably 15-person core team all had at least 10 to 20 years experience, all at big companies from Microsoft to EA. I mean, on paper, we had one of the most spectacular teams you've ever seen. But even with the super, super, super experienced guys, the investors and the publishers and stuff were very, very hesitant to do a deal with us because we'd never all worked together. We'd never all shipped something together. And that was a big problem. So, Andre, what is the difference between idea, mean good story, and to be good in craft? From the other side, if it makes sense to develop our own project or you try to hire. I'm not sure exactly what you're asking, Andre. I mean, you want to, when you're coming up with an idea for that game, so you've assembled your team now, right? And the next thing is you have to have an idea. And, and generally you want to develop that idea yourself. In at least partiality, you might outsource some of your work, so it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to do 100% of the team stuff yourself, but you definitely do need a team there. And so the idea and the concept for the game needs to be fleshed out. This is generally something, if you're putting together an indie studio and it's a new company, this is generally something that you're going to do this part of it probably nights and weekends because you haven't been able to raise money yet, right? And so you're trying to put together a really good concept. It may be all on paper, or ideally, hopefully, you could even put together a playable prototype of some kind to really show somebody what this idea is. And so, depending on the kind of game you're making, you really want to show off what that game is and what the gameplay is special. You might want to show off what the world and the universe is like, and some really, really high level stories, and things like that. But you need to have, there's two ways to interpret the word story in here, what you're saying. And so so there's a story, meaning the story of the game, like the backstory, what's happening, the history of the universe, and things like that. And that can be slightly important to have in the beginning when you're creating an idea, but you don't need to flesh it out too detailed. But what you do need to have is what you want to call a user story or a user experience there, meaning when I'm going to go out and raise money, why is this game special? Why are we special? Why are we as a company, why are we as a team going to be able to succeed? Why are we going to be able to do this, is really important. And so we need to have that story, as we call it, for an investor, that story for a publisher, that story for, somebody that's going to, come to us to really tell them why this idea is special, why this is going to work, why we believe in it, and even some hard data and some hard numbers to show why we believe, and do some forecasting and stuff to say, well, here's some competitors, here's, what we're trying to build, and there's this story behind who we are and what we're trying to do, right? And that's not about so I'm making sure that's not confused with the game story, but the story of who we are as a company and our team and our vision is just as important to create at this stage, because that's actually what most investors want to know. Most investors, if you're going to a private investor, which is the first source of money we'll talk about, they actually don't usually invest in ideas, because most investors don't understand games and they don't understand an idea. Ideas are very risky to invest in. What you really want to do is invest in the team and the people. And that's what most investors are looking at. So the story behind the team and the people and why they're special is really important to have. So, Andre, you can create some of the mythology, some of the backstories, some of the world, some of the universe, but it can be, really, really basic. At this point, you don't need to have it all fleshed out. In the very beginning, in the first few weeks or the first month, you just need to kind of have like that mile high story, that mile high view. You need to know maybe a couple key characters, a couple key stories, if your game has story. Now remember, not every game is even going to have story. So, some games may be hyper casual and it's just purely puzzles. It might be a match 3 game and that doesn't, have a story behind it necessarily, or doesn't need to. So if your game is very story driven, then you need to have more story to pitch and more story to get them excited. But if the game has very minimal story, it's more about gameplay, then you want to make sure that that's fleshed out, right? And don't go write an entire, 100-page script story, background. It might be half a page, it might be a paragraph, it might be 1 page, but you really don't need to, at this point in time, have a fully fleshed out, full mythologies, things like that. But you want to articulate why, if that story, if these characters, if the villains, or any of these things are special, if these are things that are unique, if these are things that are key differentiators, then yes, you want to understand that stuff. But again, like at a really, really high level. Don't spend the time yet to detail stuff out. You'll do that once you get farther along in the process. So, what's behind characters and the logic of environment? That's a really complicated question that, can take weeks to sort of understand, fully. But you need to, understand at a minimum at this beginning stage, just who are the key characters. If the game has characters, again, you could be driving vehicles or whatever. So again, not every game's got a character in it. But if your game is a story-driven character game, yes, you want to flesh out who the main characters are and what are they doing in the world. What are they, trying to accomplish. That kind of stuff, and then what's the world and the environment like, and how do these characters exist in that world, right? So you're trying to build these causalities, but the depth of that is really only needed at this point, right? We're trying to put together a pitch deck right now in this early stages of an indie game developer. You're going to try to put together a pitch deck that's just going to sell a concept, right? So this is really, 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 really high level stuff. Now, once you start moving out of concept and you're actually going to the design phase, then you can start detailing out the stories, the characters, the environments, the world, all the gameplay mechanics, all those kinds of things. But right now in this phase that I'm talking about, when I'm talking about putting together a concept to raise money, you don't need to go into hyper detail on those things, because again, most investors will not care. Yeah, it is very complicated, but you have to understand that, like, the things that you focus on to be a really great game designer, what you have to understand is what things are important for you to focus on and when. And so the totality of a game design is this big, massive thing, right? And it's this really complicated puzzle. And you have to kind of know, like, when to design what and to be successful. So if I'm just pitching an idea, I might just need to know this, right? I don't need to know the whole thing. And so you're really trying to figure out what is the core of the game? Why is it different? Why is it special? Why is it going to succeed? What's unique about it? All these kinds of things you're focusing on, but you don't need to know every character, every location, things like that. You're really trying to figure out kind of some general scope, scale, and with that, you're also, if you have the experience, you need to be figuring out the feasibility. So if I go to an investor and I say, I need $500,000 to make this game, make sure that you can make that game for $500,000. And if you've never done that before, you're kind of guessing. So you might want to then go out and raise, say, $50,000 to build a prototype. And so depending on your team's experience and stuff, what you build and what you design initially can change. The scope and scale of it can change, because if you've never done it before, then you really need to put together a prototype first. And once you have a prototype, you have a better idea of how long things are going to be, how complicated things are going to be, and how difficult everything is going to be. And so, but again, as an indie team, quite often, more often than not, that prototype and that initial concept phase is generally something you do on your own dime, on the side, doing it yourself. And that's generally the way that prototypes and stuff get going. But if you don't build a prototype, and if you don't have at least a pitch for your game, then the odds of you going out and raising money as an indie are very, very, very slim and very low. And so you do need to be aware of that, that going out and trying to raise money, there's a certain kind of minimum amount that you're going to need to have about your team and about your project and about, your forecast for what this thing is going to be and why people why do they want to invest in you, right? And so those are those things you're trying to put together. So, yeah, Big Lobo, a business plan can help. I wouldn't say that you need to write a super detailed business plan. It can be a very small, very short business plan, but yes, you do need some sort of, I think, to be professional, in this thing, you definitely do need to know and be able to show, again, how many people are you going to have? How long is it going to take? What are all the costs and all the overheads? Do you have, salaries? Do you have other overhead? Do you need to buy new equipment? All those kinds of things. And so you do need to kind of understand that. And again, this can be hard if this is your first game or as an indie and you're kind of guessing at some of these things. It's going to be, exponentially more difficult to raise money, when you have no track record, right? No experience. So, Andres, love, like one time be good in creating good mood, cinematography, I wrongly believe. So, just, you mean every day, work. No, I mean, I'm not quite sure. Sorry, exactly what you're meaning again. I mean, again, every game is different. So if you're wanting to create a highly cinematic game, and design that, it's one thing. But yes, making games is really hard. Making games is a lot of work, and it's not just sitting around playing video games all day, and as a smaller team, and with lower budgets, you have to be very conservative about what you're going to build. And this is why you want to go look at other indie games and look at other things and try to understand, what's the scope and scale of what I'm trying to make, and does it match what my team, my budgets, and all those things are. And I think there's often a disconnect here. So as a side story, I'll tell you a little bit of a story. I have a company in China that I own, or I'm a partner in, called Netcom. And Netcom is based out of Wuhan, China. And we have done a few games for the PlayStation and PlayStation VR. And we did a game called Reborn. And Reborn was kind of a 3D horror game. Actually, it was originally for VR, for the PlayStation VR. And a very highly immersive game. But we did it with a very, very small team and a very cheap team in China. We had probably between 12 and 15 people working on it over the course of a couple of years. But our budget was very small, and we didn't have a lot of resources. And so for me, the game, for what it wasn't perfect, but the team did an incredible job. And puzzle games are really, really hard to make because puzzles are challenging in that sometimes puzzles can be really easy to make and sometimes puzzles can be hard to make. And so it's like one person can blow through a game because they get all the puzzles, another person just gets stuck, and puzzle games can be really challenging from a design perspective to make. But again, with such a small team, our resources, even for art production, things like that, were very limited. So, hi Peters, how are you doing? So in this case, Netcom was the first developer in China to actually be developing games for consoles. And so, we were using Unity, and we were one of the first, teams in China to be using Unity. So we were very early, especially in the Chinese market with the Chinese team, no experience, in making indie games and doing this whole thing. And so there was a lot of work for us to do that. We then went to a conference, Microsoft in Shanghai. They have a nice office there, and they had a conference and for game developers in China, and they were trying to kind of get Chinese developers to start developing for the Xbox, because at the time Microsoft was not quite in China yet, but they were bringing the Xbox to China, and so they wanted to make some unique games for the Chinese market. And so Netcom being the first developer there, doing console stuff, and because of my background and being ex-Microsoft, we got invited as one of the 10 teams there to not only come to this conference, but to show our game at the conference to an executive. And so we got to go show our little indie game to this very senior executive who had a tremendous amount of experience in the industry, was head of one of the biggest game franchises, one of the biggest AAA game franchises in the world. Tremendous amount of experience, and all this kind of stuff. And our team was so excited to get to pitch the game and get some feedback. And, it was a really, really, really hard lesson, because this person that we were pitching to had been making AAA games for probably 20 years and had never worked in anything that was indie. And my team was so happy to show him the game and get this feedback. And they showed the game, and they just got torn apart by this person. And the person just slammed them left and right and told them how horrible the graphics were. Basically told them they should probably just stop making games and give up because they did such a bad job. And that, the graphics compared to, these other games and these other big AAA games were, just horrible and all these kinds of things. And my team was literally in tears. I literally, 3 of my guys were literally crying. The feedback was so negative. And they just felt ashamed and felt horrible about this whole experience. And I had to go give them this pep talk and try to show them that, it ended up that this thing that they thought was going to give them all this great feedback, this person that was going to give them this great feedback ended up really sabotaging us, because the person had no idea. They didn't conceptually understand what an indie game team went through, what a big AAA game went through. And we're talking about games that were $100,000 budget versus a $40 or $50 million budget, right? They're on exponential scales of quality and difference and manpower. A 15-person team versus about a 400-person team that they were working with, and so they're night and day difference, right? They're totally different. The scope, the scale, the quality that you can do, everything that separates what's an indie game versus a AAA game, you just cannot compare them. They can't even be in the same room, right? But some people just don't get that. And so if you're trying to make a game and you're trying to make an indie game, you really have to figure out how to overcome the cynicism and that problem of, of stuff where it's challenging because, even if you go to look at an investor, right? And you may have this really great game and you show it to them. And for an indie game, this thing could be one of the best indie games that's ever made. But if that investor or publisher or whoever is used to seeing and playing AAA games, they're going to look at your game and go like, oh, that looks horrible. Like, that's not good, and the game is really short and it's not very fun, and it has all these problems, and if they're gamers, that they may not understand that when you have different budgets and you have different teams and different skills, that you can't put these things in the same room. You cannot go head to head and try to explain why an indie game versus a AAA game, why they're different. But you often will get that problem where there's a disconnect between what you want and what they perceive the market wants, right? And they may not understand that the market dictates in the indie world something completely different. So I'm a big believer in that. I believe there is a lot of niche concepts out there. There's a lot of niche ideas that if you build them to the right price, to the right, so again, everything kind of comes back to money, right? So let's just say I'm going to build a game for $100,000. Now, I may only make, say, $250,000 profit on this game because it's niche, but that gives me $150,000 in profit, right? And so for me, if I was a 5-person team or something like that, and we're going to make $150,000, an extra profit, in 6 months of time, and we each walk away with $20,000 or something like that, that may be really good for me. That may be something that we're all really happy with, right? We don't have to shoot for the moon. We don't have to be the next World of Warcraft or the next Call of Duty or that. We don't have to go after and feel that as an indie developer that we have to make $500 million to be successful. You only need to make enough money to keep you in business, right? And to make sure you're happy and get your investors happy and make your team happy. As long as you're doing that, you win, right? And so don't feel like you have to compare yourself again to, looking at sales numbers or looking at, the money that a big AAA game is making, and that you have to go for that and you have to shoot for that, right? Look at other things and look and try to understand as an indie developer, what you need to do to make that niche game, successful for you, and how to make that, game profitable. And so when you're going to the investors and you're trying to get some money, you really have to focus on that and really try to not focus on, being the next Halo or being the next Call of Duty or whatever, and trying to sell them on hey, we're gonna make a game for $100,000 and we're gonna go head to head with the AAA games that that they just spent $100 million on, and we can beat them because we're so much smarter, better, whatever, rah. That's not the way it works, right? You just can't. Very rarely, if ever, can an indie team go up against a big AAA team. The quality of the product's not going to be as good, and the marketing and the sales and that kind of stuff just isn't going to be as strong. User acquisition is going to be a lot less. All these things on mobile games, right? So don't compare yourself as an indie and pretend that you can make a game for very cheap that's going to blow away the world, because yes, every once in a while somebody will do that, but that's that 1 in a million moonshot that you need to be careful of when you're trying to go out again and pitch the game and be realistic about what the expectations are for this game. So yeah, I mean there's a lot of scale, right, to this thing. And so what used to happen for smaller teams, if you guys are not aware of what a game publisher does, game publishers are, the group, especially in console world. Now, in the PC world, a lot of the PC developers publish to Steam or similar platforms, and they can self-publish something, and mobile can self-publish to, Android and Apple stores. But in the past, especially, you needed to have a publisher in order to publish on Xbox and PlayStation. Even though they are now allowing more indie stuff on as well, the publishers are not required, but a publisher does bring value to a game in that, they help with the sales and marketing of it. They help, make sure it's getting distributed. And so these publishers, for a very long time, kind of controlled our industry. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but what would happen with a lot of indie kind of smaller studios, whether you're an indie or like an A-level studio, basically any studio that needed money, one of the processes and one of the most easy ways for you to raise money or to get funding for your project was to put together a prototype. And then sometimes the publishers would even pay for that prototype. So if you had a little bit of skill, a little bit of relationships, you could come up with just a paper concept and then go to Microsoft or go to somebody and say like, hey, here's maybe a really simple prototype or a paper concept, something that's good. Here's our team, and here's what we want to do. And they might come back to you and say, okay, here's a small budget. Go build a prototype. Go build the full thing. And then we'll come back and evaluate it and decide if we like it, we'll fund the entire project, right? And that was a way of kind of getting an investor as well as a publisher. And I would say that the vast majority of games were funded that way for a very long time in our industry. But, the problem now with that whole process is that over time, the cost of games has gone up and up and up and up and up. And so these publishers who used to fund the prototypes and used to fund these things don't want to do that anymore. And so it's become incredibly hard to get a publisher to even fund that prototype. So those prototypes, especially in AAA or AA type games, could be $1, $2, $3 million just to fund that prototype. So that's something that an indie, or a small developer just can't do, unless you're really lucky and you can find, a good, investor. But that's it's a high risk proposition. And so that is one avenue that's still there, is to, you either can go after an investor or you can go after hopefully getting a publisher. And that sometimes can work. But in the mobile game space, which is where a lot of indies are living right now, the indie market tends to be predominantly either in mobile or on Steam. Now, it doesn't mean that there isn't some indies on consoles, but there's a lot less there. The getting the funding, getting the stuff, going right is like I said, that first hurdle you really have to come up with, for a team. So, Andres, it's kind of a long conversation, as far as being a good environment artist. We do have some better people that are more qualified that are doing 3D modeling through the CG Spectrum sites that are doing the 3D modeling courses. And so I would highly recommend jumping into one of their live streams this week and asking them, because they're a little bit more qualified for that. But really just getting good at environment modeling and becoming a master of that is where you got to start. So learning 3D Studio, learning Maya, learning how to do ZBrush, sculpting, learning the Unreal Editor, things like that. And just building your base good art skills is the most important thing. And so whether you're doing that on your own, nights and weekends, or whether you come to a school like CG Spectrum, just becoming a great artist and a great environment artist is just about building up those skills that you're going to need, every day. And so it's really just kind of that old adage of practice makes perfect. Whether you're a concept artist and you're drawing all day long, or whether you're a 3D guy who also does 3D models and texturing, so you need to have some skills probably in Photoshop or some other stuff as well. But if you're just getting started, look into if you're on a budget, you could look at programs like Blender 3D, things like that. There's some low-cost 3D modeling software. Otherwise, if you want more professional level, the Autodesk stuff, I believe they have some pretty good student deals. I haven't looked into that recently there, but you can start there and try to get some, find a good 3D modeling tool. And then also figure out how to model and texture, basically. And so you can do that with lots of lower cost tools. But again, most of these places have pretty good student discounts. You can sign up again for a school like CG Spectrum to get the full-blown, program that's going to really, at the end of that, you can go get a job. And it's much more focused. Or you can go to YouTube and places like that and find videos on how to do 3D modeling stuff. It's a lot harder because you don't quite know what you're going to get. But there is lots of resources out there, especially for environment art. Environment art's generally a little bit easier than like character modeling, so modeling props, things like that, stuff in the environment. But it takes a good eye and a good understanding for how that stuff's going to go together. So, so being a stage designer and moving to the game industry. So yeah, it's just picking up the tools and learning them is a big part in the art side. And so if you want to be like an environment artist, you just need to get the right tools and just start practicing with it. And like I said, at a minimum, pick up some YouTube videos. Udemy and places like that have some okay stuff that they'll teach you a little bit. Or again, come to a school like CG Spectrum, if you want the full thing, and get that in a couple semesters and stuff. But definitely, like I said, I recommend. We have I think 9 live streams every week. A couple of those are in concept art and in 3D modeling. I would definitely jump into those streams and ask those mentors some advice. They're a little bit more qualified. I started off as an artist, but it's been 20 years since I was doing hardcore environment art and things like that. So I've got a sense for it, but I'm definitely not as qualified about where to start in today's world and what the best tools are, and things like that. So hopefully one of those guys can point you in the right direction. But they can definitely give you a lot more hardcore advice in that area. So, welcome, Randy. So back to indie games. So you're welcome, Andres. Again, when you're starting up an indie studio, one of the biggest problems is just getting it formed, right? So to recap, we got to find the right team, put that plan together of like, why are we special? Like, why are we as a team, going to be great, right? We have maybe some experience. We've done this, we've done that. Maybe we're still students, but this is why we could do something good. So the less experience you have, the more you have to kind of prove up front. And then you gotta, put together, idea for a game, get a concept for a game, possibly a prototype for a game. And then you got to, go out and look for money. And so you could look for, again, you could do it on your own and your own dime, meaning, nights and weekends. You can get an investor. You can try to find a game publisher. And what I was starting to say about mobile games is that a lot of indies are having a harder time right now in the mobile game space. And one of the reasons for that is that the mobile publishers are so risk adverse right now that it's almost impossible to get a deal with them. And so this is where it gets tricky in that mobile game publishers, and I would say 90% of them or more, 95% of them, they don't want to invest in anything that's an idea. They literally want to see a finished game that's been in live operations, at least in open beta, for like 3 to 6 months. They want to see KPIs for success, how many users you got, what are your retention rates, your DAUs, all these kinds of things, how much money you're making. And then they will basically come in and fund, more stuff that's really for like funding user acquisition, marketing, helping you expand, go into live operations, and that way. But somehow you've got to get a game finished. And I had this trouble, a few years ago. I had an indie studio. We had the rights to the Ultraman license. And if you guys know Ultraman, very, very, very popular Japanese movie character, movie and TV shows. I mean, there's literally been hundreds of movies or thousands of TV episodes, around Ultraman for I think 20, 30 years. All the kaiju, even I think Godzilla's in that same universe, things like that. So we actually acquired the rights to Ultraman and we built a game. And we got it probably like 95% done. And we ran out of money. And we actually soft launched the game in Korea. And we had some okay KPIs and some stuff there. But we definitely needed like just a little bit more money. I mean, like $25,000 really just to finish the game and kind of get it soft launched. And, we went to investors. We went to literally, I think I had meetings with probably 50 or 60 mobile game publishers, and it was a good game. It was very different, but I thought it was really well done, and very stylized. And we failed. We didn't get it funded, and it was hard because we spent so much money and we got it right to the bitter end, but it took a little bit longer, a little bit harder. We had trouble with our developer, and it ultimately, the game never came out. And it's really sad that, that the game got that close, literally 95% done, and it was fully playable. It just had a few things that needed to get tweaked, and we, couldn't get it to market. And so again, but we spent, through our investors and stuff, we spent hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to get it, to that point, right? And it sucked that we had to walk away from it. And so, the point is it can be really challenging to make these kinds of games. And so the mobile game market, to be able to get that point, to be able to launch a game, get it out to market, test it, and see it, can take a really long time, can cost a lot of money. You need to have money for user acquisition besides just the development of the game. And how you can do that as a small indie is really, really hard. And so what ends up happening is a lot of mobile games, and remember also the market's super, super, super hyper saturated, right? There's something like 500 new games a day coming out just on the Apple App Store right now. And so, and what's happening is the vast majority of those, probably 450 or more of those a day are basically from a small developer. They make a little game, they launch it up there, it's not very good, and they basically upload it, and then they hope and they pray that somebody's going to buy it, right? But how do people find it? It'd be like putting up a website, right? And just, some website, you could have the best product in the world and you could create the best website in the world. But if you don't spend any money marketing it, if you don't advertise it at all, if you don't drive users there, if you just put it up there and go like, well, people are going to just randomly find, maybe they Google search it and they randomly find this thing, and they'll come and buy it. Like, yeah, I mean, the organic growth on mobile and on indie stuff in general is very low, right? Because there's so much out there. So if there's no discoverability to that app, then it's going to be really hard to get it out there. And so the two biggest problems for an indie developer are kind of getting that funding side of things, and like how do you get again the team together and get the company formed and get it funded. And I'd say that's the biggest problem that everybody faces. And then you got to get through and make the game and have the success of just being able to even finish the game, because it's often a lot harder than you think, and people often are more prone to fail. Even just if you've never done it before, even if you've done it 10 times, games are still bloody hard, and you may still fail, right? And so that's where it can be tricky. And so then after you've put all that together, you get your game made, you got to get it out to market, right? And so whether you're going up to Steam or whether you're going up to whatever platform it is, again, if you just go put it up there, you just upload it, what now? How are people going to do it? So you're either going to have to grassroots market it. You're going to have to go out to social media and figure out how do you spend little to no money marketing this game and getting the word out there and trying to snowball the communities. And you can go out and make posts on Reddit, or you can go find groups online. Facebook's got lots of game groups, things like that. And you can try to do what we call organic growth, right? Where you're not really spending money there, but you're doing kind of viral marketing, and you can do that and you'll make a little bit of progress. But again, that's really hard. And sometimes you get lucky, and a game will just take off, and go huge because, maybe some influencer finds your game and sees it and likes it and then does something, on it. And then ultimately, that gets you a lot of traction. That's actually how Angry Birds became so successful. Angry Birds was, a game that actually, if I remember the story correctly, and I may be wrong here, but the story that I heard was that the game was so bad that a couple websites wrote reviews on the game, basically calling it the worst mobile game that had ever come out, and just everybody thought it was kind of horrible. And it was kind of interesting that I believe that PewDiePie, if you know him, who's pretty much one of the number one streamers, heard this about this game and was oh, it couldn't be that bad. So he decided to do a review of the game, and he reviewed the game and also slammed it and was but because he was the number one guy, that one review went out to, tens of millions of people. And then all the players were oh, it couldn't be that bad. So everybody started downloading it, and then it just kind of picked up this viral traction and just built up. And the next thing you know, I forget the numbers. It was they were getting millions of downloads a day. It was just incredible. And it just snowballed. And it was kind of luck, and it wasn't through masterful marketing or anything else. It just, that was a bit of that random luck. So I'm not saying that random luck doesn't exist, but you do have to be aware that that's, needle, the old proverbial needle in a haystack, so to speak, right? That's not something you're going to, be super successful with. So, that's so getting the game made is only half the battle. And that's where a lot of indie teams are, I don't want to say arrogant or they don't quite understand. So there's a lot of game teams. I don't even say a lot of AAA teams are this way, where the development team in today's market believes that often if you just make a great game, people will buy it. Now, I think that was true 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Like, if you really truly could make a great game, and, even if it was AAA, right, if you made a really good game, on whatever platform it was, there was a pretty good chance that people would find it, pick it up, and buy it. I would argue today that, again, there's always the exceptions. But today's market, if you look at even the budgets of a lot of big teams and in smaller indie teams, if you're going to spend, let's say $100,000 on development of the game, I always recommend an absolute minimum 1-to-1 cost for user acquisition or marketing to the development budget. So if you're going to spend $100,000 to develop the game, you want to spend another $100,000 to market the game at a bare minimum, right? And realistically, you really want to have about a 4-to-1 or a 10-to-1. So if you spend $100,000 in development, you really, really, really should probably be spending about $1 million in the marketing and user acquisition. And so it actually has become more important to have a good game, not a great game, but a good game that's decent with incredible marketing and incredible user acquisition. That is a better success story than just making this incredible game that you spend a little bit of money on marketing or little to no money on marketing and user acquisition. And so the developers quite often get their panties in a bunch a little bit about that. They get upset about this because they think they're the most important person in the room because they make the game. And the truth of the matter is now that our sales and marketing teams and those guys, not only are they often working with bigger budgets and stuff than that, but really if they fail, we all fail, right? And so don't overlook that as an indie, that if you don't have someone on your team that really understands how to distribute the game, the sales and marketing, how to build partnerships, how to do user acquisition, understanding data, all these kinds of things, depending on the kind of game you're making, you will fail. Like that's the biggest thing. And so don't underestimate that, because that's where I find 90% of the indie teams that I talk to that are struggling is just because they put out a okay game or a great game and they just didn't know how to market it. And, but they didn't get enough success that they weren't able to get like a publisher involved to help them. The publishers right now in our current market typically are looking for really big, more successful games. And so the indies to the smaller studios, there's not a lot of publishers, or there's not a lot of help to help you like figure out how to do sales and marketing on that side right now. And it's tough. I am a partner in another company called Forthright Entertainment, and Forthright is we're trying to become like a next generation publisher for indie to kind of A-level games, working with smaller budgets and helping them get to market. And it's definitely been an uphill battle for us. We're still fighting that fight to get a bunch of games out and to help a bunch of these developers, because there's a huge need right now for these teams that are really great development teams. They got great engineers, great artists, great programmers, all those kind of stuff, but they don't have that experience in the sales and marketing side, which is what they really need these days to be successful. Or maybe the design of the game isn't quite right and they need some help tweaking it. They need some advice. And so with Forthright, we're trying to help do that. But we've identified that as a weakness in our market right now, is that there's not a lot of companies. There's only a few companies that we know of working in this space, trying to help these indie to the smaller developers find success. And most of the publishers, most of the people out there are doing the bigger, higher profile stuff. So, Big Globo, let's see. Yes, there is companies out there doing this, but like I said, they're not. They're mixed in what they're doing right now. I mean, again, there is some companies out there that are helping indies on the marketing sales side, but again, my experience is, at least with the developers that I've been helping with Forthright and stuff, is that they're still struggling. Those companies are still struggling to help them. So it's been a uphill battle, for a lot of these guys. So, you have to just kind of figure out, what you're going to need, and then build that relationship, right? And figure out what's really needed, for your project, right? So, and what relationships, do you need to have, in place, for it. So let's, take another 5 or 10 minutes here, and let's take a look at another game. So this was a very, very, very successful. I don't know the exact sales numbers and stuff like that, but I think both in the reviews and in the perception of this game, that Ori was a very successful game. So let's see. We'll just play on easy to make it simple here. I remember I did look at this game, the very first game. I haven't played this version, but the art style and everything else was pretty incredible. Now, I believe this one's probably a little bit more than what I would call an indie game, so I don't know their budgets exactly or things like that, but I would say that this one is kind of in that somewhere between an indie and a AAA game, and so or not AAA, but just an A level game. So, but I think they had incredible art in this, very, very stylized, and they got a lot of the mechanics and stuff right. And so it's like I'm stuck watching the cutscene here. Yeah, I think so. Why I wanted to look at this game, and why this game I think succeeded was that it was different, right? It had style, and so I think as an indie game developer, you have to differentiate, right? You have to figure out something that if you took a screenshot of this right now, like, there is no doubt in my mind, like if I saw the screenshot, I would know what this game is, right? Or I would, I'd be able to tell you that, what this game was from, versus making a really, really, really generic shooter or something. You maybe go buy a bunch of assets off the asset store. You just have another generic, photorealistic looking world that's just another shooter, and it doesn't stand apart from the rest. And so where Ori succeeded in my mind is their art director especially did an incredible job at really, making this game incredibly, good looking and, and incredibly unique, and it's very memorable because of that, right? And so, so even just the way this guy walks, like you can see his fat belly is bouncing up and down. He's got a good swagger to him. You feel like you're in this kind of storm. It's pretty good looking. The grass moving in the, the stuff there. Now, here is a little thing. Now, again, they're trying to, I think, build a more immersive world. And so here I get to here, I'm stuck. I don't know what to do. So there's no tutorials here. Now, I believe that they're doing this to try to keep you immersed in the world. They're relying on the A button being kind of an industry standard button for jump. And so that's what they're using. But there's nothing there that tells me, to press A. And so, again, not a horrible thing. But you got to be aware of who your target audience is, and are they going to figure this out? One way to overcome this as a game designer is actually, if they come up to this and say stop here, you could start a timer when they hit this bounding area. If they hit this spot, if they stand in it for say more than 3 to 5 seconds, now you could pop up a little thing that says press A to jump or something like that, or just an A button flashing, things like that would allow, so a player who's kind of savvy, they're going to come up, they're going to jump and keep going, and you don't have to worry about it. And but a player who's kind of stuck a little bit, could also get some help, right? So again, just incredibly stylistic here. I love, just their use of lighting, their use of, the foreground elements, the background elements, the art style is just fantastic. And so, they really did a great job at making this thing, very, very diverse, and its gameplay, and it just feels good. Now, this is what I wanted to kind of compare to a lot of indie games, and what I remember from my brief time playing it was the controls in this game are just absolutely flawless. Like it just feels good. It's responsive. It's it's precise, and it feels great. And I think this is again one of the biggest problems I see in indie games is they don't feel good. They often just aren't quite there. That touchy-feely of what happens when I'm playing with my controller and I'm doing things and I'm jumping and the things are just not very precise. So you need to be kind of aware of that, and that's that one thing you need to get right, So, oops, so he's shaking the tree. So I guess the trees with X's are ones he's shaking all the fruit off of, huh? He's got a little bit of a jump there, but not much. So it looks like lots of fruit and lots of food over there that you want to get to. So interesting cutscene here. Building a bridge. Now, what's interesting is that they chose to do this in a cutscene versus making it interactive. Now, my personal thing would have probably been to try to have integrated this into actual gameplay versus just making a long cutscene here. Generally it's a game, and my general rule of thumb is keep things as interactive as possible. And so it's that whole sequence could have been you going out finding logs and trying to build the bridge, and that could have been just as interesting as well. But again here, okay, I'm carrying stuff, but I'm not quite sure where to go. It's not clear what I'm supposed to do with this stuff. Do I go left or right? So again, just not a lot of direction, not a lot of help. It's very immersive. I guess they're blocking me here, so there's only so far I can go. So it looks like they want me to backtrack now. But again, just feels good. It looks good. I like all the wispy stuff that's kind of floating around. It has just a really good character stuff. And again, just that even the multi-layers of the backgrounds and how it goes back, in the depth there is just really, really well done. But I'm not sure, again, what I'm doing right now, right? I'm just, I'm running and I'm backtracking, but I'm not quite sure where I'm supposed to go or what I'm supposed to do. Now, it looks like something's about to happen here. So it looks like something bad, like a storm or something was brewing there. So they did an interesting job at kind of telling a story here, but again, a lot of cutscenes. Cutscenes also can be very expensive to make or be very hard to make, so you have to be careful, again, when you make these things, what, what's possible for your team. So now, I'm back to this guy. But I'm not quite sure what to do with him. So again, back to cutscenes. So a lot of cutscenes here. Again, not a bad thing, but it definitely has been limiting my playability, versus really getting you in and making you play the whole thing. It's like they're skipping over kind of some of the slow parts. Oops. So life withered and decayed. So and again, really, really long cutscenes here. So anyways, that's Ori. Let's punch out of that. Let's look at Moonlighter. Again, I chose these games purposefully just, or not purposefully, just randomly, right? So I have no idea even what kind of game this is. I don't even know at all like what it's, what this game is in its genre and anything else. So so obviously going through a very retro, art style with this game. Let's see what it's like. But again, as a indie, you got to differentiate, right? So they're trying to, even though there's a lot of kind of 8-bit type games out there in the market right now, it's still important that you have that very unique look to your game, and something that's very distinctive, right? And so play on normal. So again, you just need to be aware of, how does this game look different? How does this game feel different? How's the gameplay different? And how do you make this thing, feel very, very, very unique? Now, on one hand, it's kind of like this looks like 1980s or 90s graphics, so it is pretty crude. And this is the problem, right? So I'm not saying this was the wrong choice, but as an indie game, you have to make compromises. You have to do stuff that's going to allow you to make the game and the budget you have and the time you have with the team you have, with the skills you have, with the game engines, all this kind of stuff, right? And so this game is incredibly highly stylized, and there's going to be certain people that like this, and certain people are going to be like, this isn't what I like, either. And so, but again, when you're going to raise money, or something like that, somebody could, look at this and kind of go like, oh, wait, like I was just watching my son play Call of Duty last night, and like that looked killer. Now I look at this and the graphics look 20 years old, and it feels very dated. Now, some people will get that retro is kind of in. Some people will get, why it's a distinctive look, and that can be good. But again, some people just don't. And so you do have to be aware of that, and that not everybody's going to get your vision. Not everybody's going to get and understand really why you're doing what you're doing. And so, but again, this can be unavoidable, in these kinds of games, because you're making something retro that you can do in the time you've got. So let's see here. So I'm running pretty fast now. It feels pretty good. He's pretty speedy. So rocks that I can't go through. Okay, these I can destroy. So I don't know if I'm supposed to destroy these or if I'm looking for something. So this is another thing, just as a general like game design hint. When you're designing games and you're building these things out, stuff like these destructibles, like after a while, if I do this and I don't know that there's something there, like I'm gonna stop. Like so far as I can tell, let me see. Yeah, I don't think that's doing anything. And so, oops. Okay, that was fun. Oops, that was fun. Okay, so left trigger. But again, I did not know. Okay, so up here, there's a left trigger thing. But I didn't see that. Whoops. Okay, don't go back into him. So it looks like I'm just using left trigger. But these little destructible things, again, I don't know what they're serving. And after a while, when you're doing the same thing over and over, you're... Whoa. All right, so... All right, looks like left trigger kind of gets me through a lot of these things. Oops, so... Uh-oh. Ah! But again, all these breakables, like including these things here, there's all these breakables. Okay, there I got something. So it looks like there is some stuff in those. But again, I'm not quite sure why I'm doing, the amount of breakables I'm doing and what I'm picking up. It's not very clear what the reward is. And so these look locked, which I'm wondering now. Okay, this guy's got a little bit more health. Okay, so then, I killed him. Got some stuff to pick up. And then these chests now. Okay. So, pretty rudimentary game. I think I died. It's very, yeah, this ramped up really fast. Like this, I went from almost no combat to suddenly now like this crazy combat scenario where I've just got guys coming at me from every direction. This is like way too hard. Okay, that's pretty frustrating there. So I went from almost having no enemies to suddenly like tons and tons of enemies all on one screen. That did not do a very good job at ramping me up. It taught me one or two basics and then basically like felt like it just threw me into the fire. Like I would have rather had something where I maybe had 4 enemies and a couple different combinations and then stuff. And this one was that was a little too much, unless it was meant to make me die. Now occasionally games will do that where they purposely force you to die, so that you can, and then it'll progress in some way, shape, or form. And that could have been meant there where I was unsurvivable. But again, as a player, I feel like I failed. And now I'm like, do I want to replay this? And like, can I keep doing it? Or, I mean, I don't even have the option. But again, that's where it can get confusing. But it looks like in this case, it looks like they're kind of telling me, I was supposed to fail. They're kind of doing a little Zelda thing here where, I wake up in a house, now my mentor is here and he's going to teach me some stuff and probably give me some better equipment, and kind of set me on my way. So this is Fatima wouldn't showing us that the breakables are actually breakable be good so that we would do it more often later on for the items. Well, the problem is that, when you have a bunch of breakables and let's just say that only 10% or 5% or 1% of those breakables have a reward inside of them, at some point players are going to lose interest. They're kind of like, okay, am I going to run around and press this button 100 times to get this one thing maybe randomly, right? And so the trick in game design is you want to make sure that reward is consistent enough and often enough that even if it's something small, that I feel like it's worth me doing, right? So if I'm going to go try to break every breakable there is, trying to find maybe that one little thing that I don't know is there, eventually I'm going to be like, forget it. I'm not going to, keep trying to do breakables. So that's the danger there with breakables is, they can serve a purpose, but if there's not a good balance between the reward and the time spent, then people will get frustrated. And so that's where it can be hard. I don't know what's going on here. I guess it wants me to buy things or sell things. This is strange. So it looks like some RPG mechanics here. All right. Well, that's enough of Moonlighter. So, in making indie games, again, the challenge is that, like I was saying, you have to have something very distinctive. You have to scope and scale the project to something that's reasonable. And, if you guys don't have a lot of experience and you're trying to make your own game, you may just, again, need to build something to prove that you can do it, both to yourself and to others. And also just to see if you can do it. And then also just to see how long it's going to take, right? So, again, the biggest mistake that a lot of developers or people will make, especially indies, is they'll underestimate how hard it really is to make the game and get it out. And so if you're trying to put together, again, like a real company, and you're going to go and you're going to try to, have salaries and, have a real company, and let's just say you want to go out and raise $500,000, and you just kind of randomly choose that, right? So what happens? You go out and you raise $500,000, you find an investor, Uncle George has got some money set aside. He's willing to give it to you, and so you go out and you raise that money, and then what, right? Because do you really know this game can be done for $500,000? Are you guessing? Are you just pulling a number out of thin air? And I see this a lot where developers don't really know how much time it's going to take, what the resources required are going to be. They overscope. They have this big, massive idea, but they have a budget like this, right? And so I can't even tell you how many times, literally in my life, hundreds, if not thousands of meetings with people that are like, even people that have money. And, I've talked to so many people that were like, they want to get into AAA games. They wanted to get into, stuff. And, and this is in an era where, maybe we were spending 15, 20, 25 million to make a AAA game, right? And these people come in and be like, I got lots of money. I want to make like 3 games, and I want to like do this, this whole big thing. And they want to be, very, very successful. And so you're having these kind of preliminary talks and you're like, oh, this sounds awesome. Like this guy's going to fund me to do 3 games. And I'm getting all excited. And we finally get down to the brass tacks, so to speak, to talk about real dollars, and literally I had a guy that was like, oh, well, I've got $2.5 million. And I'm like, dude, like, we need like 60 million to do what you're doing, maybe 50 million, like not 2.5, right? So $2.5 million to me and to most people in the world, that's a lot of money, right? So in his mind, $2.5 million was a huge amount of money. And I don't blame him. That is a lot of money, for most people, right? But you can't be competitive against your Halos and, your Call of Duties and, your Age of Empires or whatever is the biggest AAA game in that space that you're competing against if you're spending 1/10 the budget. You just can't be that way. Now, that being said, one of the things that our industry, I think in the last 5 years has gotten significantly better at is supporting the indies and making it possible to put out games for a lot cheaper. And so, again, you could scope and scale. So let's just make an easy number. Let's say that guy had $3 million, right, and wanted to make 3 games. Then as an indie developer, I could say like, okay, I will make you 3 games, $1 million each, and then what I would do is say, okay, so an actual development budget, then I would say, so I'm going to spend $500,000 to make the game and $500,000 to market the game or do user acquisition. That's how I would divide the budget. So now I have 3 games, $500,000 each for development, and then work backwards, right? So then I'd say like, okay, here's my overhead. Here's how much my team is per month, and I would kind of then be able to guesstimate and say like, okay, so let's just say my team costs me $100,000 per month, all things together. Then I would know that I have 5 months, maybe 6 months if I spent $600,000 on the development and $400,000 on marketing if I had to. Well, let's just say it's 6 months to make it easy. So, I now know I can make these 3 games, and it's great. I've got the investor, I've got the games, but again, you have to be realistic about the fact that you're not playing in the AAA space, right? You're still playing in that indie A level space. If you're spending $500,000, you get what you pay for, and it's going to be games like this that you're going. That's your target audience, right? And so therefore, your revenue, assuming you're not going to have a random breakout hit, but you have to look at Steam charts and look at that kind of stuff and say like, okay, there's other indie games like these, and these games might make $2 million, right, in profit. Or maybe they make $10 million, but whatever. But even if it makes only $2 million in profit, that's going to be, or $2 million total revenue, then, you're making about $1 million then. So you spent $1 million on development and marketing. You're going to make $2 million. So that gives you $1 million now in the bank. Now, if that game is on mobile or Steam or whatever, you're going to take 25 or 30% of that right off the top. You have to pay somebody on some platform somewhere, right, to do that. So suddenly you just lost, $250,000, straight off the top there. And as you start chopping away, if you had a publisher, if you had an investor, those things, that investor may want his million back. So you had to pay back. You make $2 million, but that investor gets his $1 million back. But that investor doesn't want just his base back. He wants his base plus probably double. So really that investor may say, depending on the deal you sign, might have wanted that full $2 million to himself. And you have to make $2 million, pay him off $2 million, and then you get to start making money after that. So you have to be really careful as an indie developer when you're signing these deals, when you're working with investors and you're working with this stuff, how you set up your company, how you structure your business deals can make or break you, because you got to remember that there's all these costs that are gonna come in there, and you got to repay not just the base amount of your investment, but you got to give them dividends and give them more, right? And so if you're not careful, I've seen many indie developers like have a semi-successful game that actually became profitable, and they still went out of business because they didn't have enough money to keep them operating. The second thing you got to consider as an indie developer is that quite often, depending on the platform and stuff you're doing, and this is especially true if you're crazy and you're doing an indie developer with a retail game, that's 10x harder. But even in digital, when you go out and you sell to digital platforms, and you let's say you work for 6 months, you launch that game, and you think like, okay, I'm gonna sit back and wait for all my money, right? And cha-ching, wait, where's the money? And because that could still take a really long period of time for that money to come back in. So you may be on Steam and they're making sales, and stuff, but some of that stuff is on net 30, net 60. So you may not see revenue for like 30, 60, 90 days sometimes for that stuff. And so again, if you use every penny of your investment, if you use all of your money just to get out the door, and you have no money beyond that, then a lot of companies will go out of business. We had that happen. I was at a company called Rialto Entertainment some years ago. We did a game called Bandfuse. Bandfuse was a game, that was designed to teach people how to play guitar. And the game came with a real cable that you could plug in a 1/4-inch jack from a guitar into your Xbox or PlayStation, and you could it was kind of like Rock Band or whatever, but you played it with a real instrument. And Bandfuse was a great game. We did an amazing job. The team did absolutely great. We weren't indie, but we were, somewhere in between. We had a decent budget, but we were, maybe 20 people of our core team plus some contractors. So we were a little bit above an indie team, but we were still a small independent team. But the way that our CEO had structured our money was we basically had enough money to get the game out the door, and we were a retail game, going on to Xbox and PlayStation. He had never factored in the fact that when you're selling into Walmart and you're selling into these stores, that not only you have to go through a publisher, and that publisher is going to take a chunk and whatever, but what would happen is Walmart, would sell a retail game, but then they would hold the profit for, I believe it was 60 days, because if somebody did a return, they didn't want to give you your money and then try to get money back from you because somebody returned it. So they would hold on to that money for like 60 days for their return policy. And then if that person does not return the game, then they would give that money, to the publisher. Now that publisher would then give you another 30 or 60 days on the return of that money. So suddenly now we were like, at least 90 to 120 days out from every sale before we saw any of that money come back to us, right? And so it was one of those things, but we only had enough money to get us out the door. And we didn't think about, and we kept warning the CEO, like, we need more money, we need to have runway so that we can keep operating, and also doing DLC and doing other stuff along the ways. And so we were trying to get extra money for that, but we literally ran out of money and we had to shut down the company, and it sucked. We had all this DLC that we were planning. We had all this long-term stuff. The game actually was pretty well received, all these things, but we didn't have that extra money, that extra buffer to survive even after the game came out. And this is, a very common problem with a lot of indie developers, is that you don't know how to structure the deals. You don't know how to get enough to make the game and survive the game. And then these days, especially in mobile, the live operations is everything, right? And you need enough money to like not only get the game out, but you really need like 6 months minimum, if not a year, of like operating that game, keep running the game, get user acquisition, keep polishing the game, tweaking the game, and doing all the live operations on the game. And then, it takes it a while for mobile games to really pick up. And there's been a number of games that are live operated, both in mobile and in the PC console space, that the developers or the publishers were smart enough that they didn't give up on it right away. There's some games that even 3-6 months in still weren't doing very well. I believe one of those games was like Rainbow Six Siege, as far as a AAA example of that, where Rainbow Six Siege, if I don't remember the numbers exactly, but in the first year, it wasn't doing very good. I mean, it was definitely not making money. It was definitely not, doing well. But Ubisoft, to their credit, believed in it. And Ubisoft kept investing in it. And so they had a huge investment to get the game done, and to get the initial game made and to launch it. And then they just kept investing and investing. And I believe they spent about another year continuing to invest in the game, polishing the game, adding more content. And it took it about that first year, and then suddenly it just struck an accord. It was a combination of, enough word of mouth getting out there, enough people starting to play it, but Ubisoft kept tweaking it and tweaking it and tweaking it, adding content, and it suddenly just hit. And then suddenly the boom, the monetization and the revenue and everything just went, and it just took off. And to their credit, they believed in it enough that they kept reinvesting in it. But most indie teams don't have that budget and that time and that money to keep reinvesting in the live operations of a game. And so this is again where the success of these things, unfortunately, it just keeps coming back to money. And that's the hardest question to answer. But when you're going out and you're shopping for money, make sure you're not just trying to get just enough to like squeeze out the bare game, because you've got a 50-50 chance of probably going out of business. And I'd probably say even an 80% or 90% chance of going out of business if you don't, again, understand how your money is going to come back in, how long is it going to take to come back into you, how much of that money are you actually going to make. Again, a lot of developers don't realize, and they don't think about the deal structures and these deal terms. And even if they go out with a publisher, this is one of the, I'll warn you guys, sometimes with publishers and when you're structuring deals, you really have to read the fine print. And some publishers are kind of a little guilty sometimes about doing bad things. And what they can do is, there's a lot of like cost overheads that they'll have kind of a line item there that basically says that once there's profit, once there's money that's being made, then you guys will split that up in some percentage chance, and that the percentage will be anywhere from a small developer could get 5 or 10 or maybe 20% rev share, but usually the company that's funding it and putting all the investment in is the one that gets the lion's share of so the higher risk, the more reward that person takes in. So if a publisher or that person is funding you, and let's say they give you the $1 million, they're going to take the lion's share of the revenue and the profits, for quite a while in order to kind of recoup, their risk, right? And so there is a challenge there, and so you need to be careful, right? And you need to know how to structure that deal, because what a publisher will also do is, again, they use the word profit. Now, and they could term it other things as well: gross revenue, net revenue. There's lots of legal things they'll say, and there's lots of kind of smoke and mirrors stuff. But what a lot of times they'll do is they'll say, like, well, we're spending money on marketing, we're spending money on the sales teams, we're spending money here and there. We made a TV commercial, and we did this and we did that, and they may do all of that without your approval as a developer, and then they'll basically then say, like, well, we spent all this money marketing your game, and then so we're going to take that off the top. We're going to take that all off the profit, and so suddenly now your profit, which you thought was going to be this. Suddenly, by the time you pay Steam and you pay, Apple or whoever, shrinks by 30%, and then there's the publisher themselves takes a chunk. But then they have all these marketing overhead, and pretty soon your profit margins are like this small, right? And suddenly you're not making any money at all, right? And so I've seen many developers go out of business because they underestimated, and they just thought, like, well, okay, we think we could sell 300,000 copies of this game, at $10 a piece. So we're going to make $7, and they think we're going to make, $5 profit ourselves. And that's what they're kind of guessing. And then they think, so 5 times 300,000, we're doing okay. Like we're making some good money. But the reality is they might be making $1 or $2 a piece, not, $5 a piece, and, and stuff like that. So and again, that money may not come in until later. So the way that you structure a deal, the way that you're setting up the deal for your game has everything to do with how successful you're also going to be in the long term. And so if you're a new indie developer and you're setting up this new company, make sure you hire a good game attorney. I'll plug my friend Patrick Sweeney. He's got his own company, that you can Google him, that does game law. Like, he's one of the best out there. There's a few guys out there that specialize in game legal side of things. So make sure, if you're an indie, spend those $10,000 or whatever you got to spend to make sure that your legal agreements between anybody and everybody are rock solid. And again, I've seen tons of developers get burned by this and not really having ironclad contracts. There was lots of loopholes and lots of things in there, and they got burned. And so don't be one of those either. So, it's tricky. Making indie games and the business side of things is really hard. And so once you've kind of figured out what your budget is, once you figured out, what you got to work with, again, you got to kind of work backwards. You got to prove that, like, okay, if I've got $500,000, what can I make for that? Like, what's the scope and scale of the game that I can really make? How do I kind of cut corners? How do I get away with not doing something that's, this big, but I can make something small, be conservative with that. I can get across what I want. How do I, reuse more art? How do I reuse programming? How do I, do certain things just to be able to get the thing out, right? And it may not be perfect, but you can at least get it to market. But remember that, you really have to focus on getting the controls just right, getting the look and feel just right, and making it very attractive, very distinct, and that kind of stuff will really set you apart. If it's just another game with random, stuff that you bought in a store, if it's just another photorealistic game, if it's not distinct, you're going to really have a lot of trouble. So hopefully, that kind of gives you guys some ideas about kind of the business side of making indie games. Again, it's really about, figuring out what you've got to make, figuring out, what you can do, and then proving that you can do that. Again, make a prototype, make something and do it once. Build one level, right? If your game has 100 levels, build one and then say, like, okay, that took us a week, right? We built one level in a week. So now build the second level, and that took another week. So now you can kind of go like, all right, well now, we got, 80 more weeks to go if you want 100 levels, right? And maybe we got 5 guys, that's there, but that's that's something you've got to kind of figure out. Now, something else to kind of be aware of, if you're, I get this question a lot from a lot of my students and various people looking for advice to get into game development. The problem with say being a designer on an indie game versus a AAA game is that when you're working on a AAA team and you're working on a really big team, you generally will have a team behind you. And so even as a designer like myself, if I go to Ubisoft or I go to EA, I go to Sony, I might be on a team that has 10, 20, 50, even 100 designers on, some of these teams. And so I'm just one minion of many. But what that allows me is that my scope of my specialty is just this, right? I do this all day long. I build levels, or I do systems, or I do multiplayer, and I've got this tight thing that I can be a super specialist in, right? I can do that. And so on one hand, that's kind of nice because I don't have to know as much, but I have to be really, really, really good at what I'm doing, right? And that there's kind of a difference there. Versus when you're on an indie team, and if you're looking to start your first indie team or join your first indie team, one of the challenges here is that you have to have a much broader skill set. Now, you may not necessarily have to be as good at that thing because you may not have to build as perfect the levels or things like that, but you may have to know, you may be the only designer on the team, and you literally have to do the system designs, the level designs, a lot of the implementation, all those kinds of things. You may have to be doing all of that yourself. You may not have the skills to do absolutely everything. And so it's a tough dilemma because I know a lot of people that want to go in and be a game designer, on indie stuff. And I know people that want to be game designers on AAA stuff. And both of them have very similar skill sets. But again, one kind of has to be a bit more of a jack of all trades. One has to be a bit more of a specialist. And so you need to understand, how that works, right? So, if you're studying to be a game designer and you're trying to get into indie stuff, make sure that you're getting a bigger breadth of knowledge because you're going to have to be doing a lot more things probably by yourself. And you have to make choices again about how big can this game be or how big is it supposed to be, and that kind of thing, and to learn how to scope and scale it versus when you jump into a AAA team, they probably have a lot of process, a lot of procedures. They've done it before, they kind of know what they're doing, and so you're going to get stuck on doing this one thing all day. But for a lot of people, that's great because you can become a specialist and really do an amazing job at this one thing and be hyper-focused, right? And versus being a super generalist. And so as a game designer there, you need to kind of understand the pros and cons of going into AAA versus indie. So we're just about out of time. We got 5 more minutes left. If anybody has any more questions, please ask. Otherwise, I'm going to jump in and do one more quick game deconstruction here and go from there. So this is interesting. Even from the start here, press Y to begin. I would say that 95% of the games I play, if not all of them, use the A button to start. So kind of funny right from the start that they're doing something that's a little bit non-traditional. But let's just jump in and try a new game here. So again, very blocky, pixelated art. And again, you'll see this a lot in a lot of indie games because they're choosing an art style or something that's feasible for them to do with their small team and the time they have. Let's see here. So I guess it's kind of weird. So my different characters, I'll just choose somebody randomly here since we don't have a lot of time. And so again, I have no idea what this game is. This was another random pick and a random choice to kind of see. A little bit of a rough front end there. The UI on that was definitely not very good. Definitely had a lot of, stuff around, a lot of problems. So here, the first thing I'm noticing is there looks to be 2 characters. but those characters are really, really, really hard to read in the background art. Now, the only reason I'm sort of noticing them is they are animating, so they're kind of moving a little bit. And the one character looks to have a targeting cursor around him. But I'm a little bit, again, interface here is, I'm not quite sure what I'm doing. So typically when you have a character, you really want to make sure your characters pop in the environment. It's a little bit, okay. Not sure. I have no idea what's going on here. I don't know where my character is, and wow, this interface is really rough. So back to this. So you want your characters to really pop in your world, and you want to make sure they're always visible. So in 3D games especially, we use what's called rim lighting. And there's a little bit of highlight to a character that really makes sure they pop out. Or you want something that's gonna be an outline around a character, or something that really makes sure that character pops in the world and the environment. So this one, not only are they really hard to read here, and I have no idea what this interface is doing here, but I can barely see my guy up here. So it looks like instead of controlling a specific, so it looks like my guy is just functioning on his own. So I guess it's more of a roguelike type game where he's just, now I don't know how to, so it looks like I can make him move. But again, I can barely see my character there, only because there's a highlight, but I can barely even see him. So again, just, it's tricky. I'm not sure how to, so yeah, it's a little bit, it takes definitely some getting used to. There was no tutorials here, and it was definitely pretty rough around the edges. So anyways, that was that game, Dungeons of the Endless. Again, just, I would say that one was the biggest example of what not to do as an indie game. Make sure the game, you know how to play it. Make sure the interface is easy to use. Make sure your characters and stuff are identifiable and you understand what you need to do. Hi, Bernardo, no worries. No, I don't know who. Yeah, the UI on that was pretty bad. Definitely took some getting used to, and without any tutorials or anything like that, I was definitely fumbling around in that game. So, again, common problem with a lot of indie games is they just rush a lot of stuff. And, you can't blame them. They're doing their best to get it out. They may not have the best skills in every area, like interface design, things like that. But again, just keep in mind, interface design and controls, readability, and distinction, in your stuff is going to make or break you as an indie. So, anyways, I hope this helped you guys. Thank you all so much for spending your time with me. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to hopefully seeing you all back here next week. And otherwise, be safe and have a great week. So thank you.